Our last session, which is what I called Ancient Hebrew Psychology. And I thought it might be an interesting way to end. And you'll see how this goes. In a way, then, I'm going to give you a little bit of a Hebrew lesson. And even for some of you who've had some Hebrew, it might still be interesting to see what I stick out there. And for those of you who haven't had any, which is most of you, then it's a little bit of a sense of what you get out of bringing the language to the study of any people, modern or otherwise. So can you give me some categories for how we understand the human person? So I'm trying to be as generic as possible, right? So how do you, like, what makes up a person? Just in modern terms. Can you give me? I'm trying not to prime the pump. Go ahead. Sex. Well, but of course it depends what you mean by that. It can either mean doing sex or it can mean gender. So, but whichever you actually meant, at least number two would be the kind of, that's probably what you meant, right? Was the category, right? So male or female, so gender would be the more sort of technical term to avoid the sort of doing aspect per se. But yeah, so I mean, so gender could be a category. That's interesting because this is funny because for them, of course, in fact, the languages were gendered in a way that at least English itself doesn't tend to be. But I'm not sure they had a category of gender, right? So if they were talking about the human, I don't know that they had something that was femaleness or maleness or a category of gender that would include both. Yeah, it's a good category. All right, what were you going to say?
The question, what makes up a person?
Yeah.
Based on, I think, today, it's mostly that they have the ability to speak and understand.
Right. So how would that be as a kind of category for defining a person? Like, is there a single word you could give to such a thing? Intelligence, yeah. So I mean, so that in a way you could say intelligence, good, right? But I mean, you could say the mind or something like that, maybe, right? Or your brain, if you want to get more biological, anatomical. Is there anything else? So we have, on one hand, we have gender, which is a kind of a sort of basic breakdown of human society into these two sexual parts of a community that enable it to reproduce, I guess. And then on the other hand, we have something that applies to everybody. So intelligence, mind, brain. Is that it? Yeah.
Personality?
Yeah, so that's an interesting direction to go, to say personality, which, of course, so I suppose an interesting thing is I could say, well, that should be your mind also, right? So in a way, intelligence is one thing and personality is another thing, both of which relate to our minds. So I suppose we got to think about how many pieces we're going to break the mind into, or how many different dimensions we're going to use to look at it. Got any other ideas? Occupation. So no, actually, I mean, so that's a sort of what you do kind of category, which is a fair game. It leads in another direction, right? It's outside of the human person.
I feel like whenever someone meets me, they always ask me what I do.
Yeah, fair enough. Go ahead.
Our belief system, not necessarily religion, but whatever.
Yeah, what do you believe in? And then it's a good question that could relate to culture in a way, sort of what culture you belong to, as well as, I mean, again, it could go into the heap of intelligence and personality, and it's part of the activity of your mind. Well, so, I mean, once upon a time, people used to talk about the soul. Ever heard of that word? Yeah. So, or people would talk about the spirit, or you could talk about your body. But of course, part of the complication of modern science and modern perspectives on being human is that the line between the body and anything else is kind of like it's difficult to define what parts of your mind, your intelligence, your personality, what you believe in, are totally disconnected from your body, right? So that you wouldn't define them in terms of your body. But once upon a time, things really were. So, so this is the line of thought that I wanted to get you started on. Mari, if we could start. So I wanted to put out a biblical text just to launch us. And this is something from the prophet Ezekiel. So in a way, I guess I want to spend this last class exploring the ancient Israelite mind. And so I thought that, in order to get us thinking about the mind, I'd pick an example of a text that presents a rather odd person, or at least a person who seems to have kind of an odd state of mind. And it's good to start with prophets if you want that. Like just to think that you've heard voices and that the voices are God telling you what to tell everybody else. And just to be willing to stand up in front of crowds and tell them that they're all stupid and they're all disobedient and judgment is going to rain down on them, like the guy with the sandwich board that says the world is going to end tomorrow. And, this is these people. You've got to be a little bit strong-minded, at least, to decide that you want to do this and that you really believe it and you're willing to take the flack for doing it. So already, all the stories about prophets, they're a little interesting. So I picked a story about Ezekiel. Remember, even from last class when we looked at the canon, right? This is the last of the three major prophets, the three big prophet books. And Ezekiel is a weird guy. And the thing that makes the book of Ezekiel stand out amidst all the books that are associated with writing of prophets is that the book of Ezekiel, my favorite, right? Come in just to drop off the paper. Mark it down. Okay, so the thing about Ezekiel is that it's written more in the first person than any other book that's identified with the various characters of prophets. And so it gives you a chance to hear at least someone who says he's a prophet speaking for himself. So here's Ezekiel, and this is what it says. It did say that. You, O mortal, take a brick and set it before you. On it portray a city, Jerusalem, and put siege works against it, and build a siege wall against it, and cast up a ramp against it, set camps also against it, and plant battering rams against it all around. It's like a toy, right? So imagine we'll make a little model city. It's like when you were a kid. More of the boy toys maybe, right? But first you make something, and then you get to destroy it. Then take an iron plate and place it as an iron wall between you and the city. Set your face toward it and let it be in a state of siege, and press the siege against it. This is a sign for the house of Israel. Then lie on your left side and place the punishment of the house of Israel upon it. You shall bear their punishment for the number of days that you lie there. How many days do you think it's going to be? Like a day and a half? A week? For I assign to you a number of days, 390 days. That's a year and what? A month? Equal to the number of the years of their punishment, and so you shall bear the punishment of the house of Israel. When you have completed these, you shall lie down a second time, but on your right side, and bear the punishment of the house of Judah. 40 days I assign you, 1 day for each year. You shall set your face toward the siege of Jerusalem. With your arm bared, you shall prophesy against it. See, I am putting cords on you so that you cannot turn from one side to the other until you have completed the days of your siege. And Take wheat and barley, beans and lentils, millet and spelt, put them into one vessel, and make bread for yourself. During the number of days that you lie on your side, 390 days, you shall eat it. The food that you shall eat shall be 20 shekels a day by weight, whatever, he's arranging it specifically, and you shall drink water by measure, at fixed times you shall drink. You shall eat it as a barley cake, baking it in their sight on human dung. The Lord said, thus shall the people of Israel eat their bread unclean among the nations to which I will drive them. Then I said, ah, Lord God, I have never defiled myself from my youth up until now. I have never eaten what died of itself or was torn by animals, nor has carrion flesh come into my mouth. And then he said to me, see, I will let you have cow's dung instead of human dung, on which you may prepare your bread. So, what do you think of somebody who says these things? What would you say about this person's state of mind? Yeah?
Well, in modern times, we would say they have schizophrenia.
So that's an interesting technical reaction. So,
Well, if someone on the street may have told you that God told them to do something,
yeah?
probably assume that.
Again, not to be too personal, I have these 3 kids that went through a lot of stuff, and at one point our daughter was in and out of hospitals, and the key question was whether she had actually heard voices or was just saying that she'd heard voices. But it's pretty much what you said, right? I mean, and if they had concluded that she had actually been hearing voices, then that would have meant a pretty serious kind of like psychotic break, sort of. Yeah. So, I mean, but right away then the question is, how does prophecy relate to such questions? Like, how would we treat people who understood themselves to be prophets? Now, I mean, it seems like we have many stories of prophets who led useful and productive lives, depending on how you measured them. In fact, this is another sort of funny connection. A friend of mine who had been through intensive therapy about something said, oh, he really liked this thing that Freud had said, which was that you could base sanity on an ability to work and an ability to love. So let's give these prophets credit, whatever voices they may be hearing. But you're right. I mean, so right off you could say, like, just the hearing voices things today would make people wonder. Did you?
Are you asking what the author is thinking?
Well, more freeform than that. Like, but how do you respond?
I think that whoever's writing this is saying that is like negative. He's saying that he's predicting that Israel, or he thinks Israel is doing something wrong.
Yeah, I mean, for sure you could identify this as a person with a really serious passion, you could say, or really strong opinions, and a very creative ability to express them. And of course, that's why, this is really interesting how we understand the state of mind that can generate this kind of behavior and this kind of literature. But of course, see, then the thing is that a lot of the prophetic writing expresses a very strong opinion about sometimes just politics, society, religion certainly, and publicly. But along with that, the reason I picked this passage is that this guy, Ezekiel, is capable of some really weird behavior. And there are 2 things, right? I mean, there's the lying down on one side for over a year. This is just, even for a prophet, this is really unusual. And then there's the added bit about, dealing with the uncleanness by saying that God told him that he has to. I mean, of course, you have to imagine how this sounds. Like, okay, I'm talking to all of you, my observers, and I want you to know that I may look weird by eating this food that's been baked on cow dung, but the reason I'm eating it on cow dung, or baked on cow dung, is because originally God told me that it had to be human dung, but I talked him out of it. At that point, you think, okay, I guess, whatever you say, right? But at any rate, one thing you should get out of this, and this is partly because, when you put this, what strikes us as just crazy, side by side with prophecy and a real kind of cultural tradition that has a place, you get a strange mix that results in some states of mind, some attitudes, some ways of thinking that would lead us to sort of call 911 and bring in the professionals to to handle somebody like that. And since he's going to be there for 390 days, you've got plenty of time to find somebody to help you out. So this is what I want to do then. I want to take a block of time, probably half an hour or something, to walk you through 4 terms and a few biblical texts that go with them that define dimensions of the human person, the question I asked you in the first place, that are in biblical Hebrew. And then I wanted at the end, to see how far we have time, to bring you back to the story of King Saul, who's another character in a completely different way, who's portrayed as being in an unusual state of mind. Now, a difference is that Ezekiel does not portray himself or is not portrayed as being, inappropriate, beyond, he may not be normal, but nobody considers that there's something wrong with his mind. And I suppose what's interesting is that the story of Saul suggests that something is considered wrong with his mind. And then the question is what that means. And of course, one of the strangest things about King Saul is that he is associated with prophecy. That his very state of mind is connected with the fact that he's the only king who's said to join up with gangs of prophets that go around behaving strangely. And there's some connection there that even they drew between the prophecy that I began with and Saul that I'd hoped to end with. Okay, so is this going to work? Yeah. Okay. So let me start with the first term. So the first term is basar, which you could spell B-A-S-A-R, which literally is flesh. And not exactly meat, because that would tend to be dead flesh. So we'll talk about flesh that could be alive or dead. And so I threw out a couple of passages which have this term. And so what translation is this anyway? Oh yeah, this is this new RSV. But it's no, this is good actually. Let's go with it because it's no, this will do because they're pretty literal. So you'll see, right? Genesis chapter 6 is just before the flood story. And so you've gotten through the creation, Adam and Eve in the garden, then they have this little problem with the fruit, then you get Cain and Abel, who are the first 2 offspring of the human couple, and they don't get along so well, and Cain kills Abel, and so then, the world begins to go down a sort of messy path. Then you're given the big genealogy in chapter 5, and in chapter 6 you're told this really strange story about how the sons of God, or sort of divine beings, intermarry with, have sex with, the daughters of men and create giants and some kind of pre-flood beings. And in the midst of that story, you're told, then the Lord said, my spirit, so there's another category, shall not abide in mortals forever, for they are flesh. Their days shall be 120 years. So the first thing that I wanted you just to see is that in this one passage, this category of flesh is basic to what it is to be human, as opposed to what? Like, what's the alternative here? Yeah, somebody said it. Yeah, well, somebody said immortal, somebody said divine, I think, right? So, yeah, as opposed to divine, right? So it's not as opposed to being an animal, for instance, which would be, like for us, if you say, what's it mean to be human? Then the question would be, well, as opposed to a chimpanzee or something like that. For them, that was not the issue. The issue was, what's the difference between being human and being divine? And so the difference would be that they are not flesh, that we are. So major category for them, that this is part of what distinguishes humanity from deity. They are flesh, their days shall be 120 years. It's what makes us die. So then you go a little farther down and you start the flood story, and it's said that humanity is all messed up. And so God decides that he's going to start all over, just wipe the slate clean. And so in the midst of this early description of the flood, what's going to be the flood story, it says, "And God saw that the earth was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted its ways upon the earth. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. Now I am going to destroy them along with the earth." So again, I mean, the flesh is tied to being mortal, and in a way possibly tied to being fallible in some way, or at least this is a good question whether the problem is that humans are fallible, and I'm trying to use a not immoral word. I'm not saying they're evil per se. So the question is whether they're sort of morally evil or whether they just rebel against God and God doesn't like it. But all of this seems to go with being flesh. So overall, if I had to say, well, so what are you going to do with this first category, that humanity is flesh? Then the answer is especially that as flesh, humans are mortal, that humans die. Okay, so next category. The second word is nephesh, which you can spell N-E-F-E-S-H, for one, at least that pronounces it, nephesh, which may originally mean something like throat. There's a word in Akkadian, which is napishtu. I don't know if you can even hear it. The F and the P are the same word, and it's got the same sh sound, N-A-P-I-S-H-T-U. It's a feminine noun that has the T to mark the feminine, and the U is just to tell you what part of the sentence it's in. So this word actually does mean throat in Akkadian. In the Bible, in ancient Hebrew, it's a good question how it should even be translated. It used to be translated soul, but of course that implied certain categories that were more kind of Greek and Latin than really Hebrew. Sometimes it's translated life. So let's read one passage. The top one. Deuteronomy 12:23. So in the book of Deuteronomy, last of the law, laws of Moses books, chapter 12 is the beginning of the actual law, you could say. It's the beginning of the long list of various teachings on how society should work. And so toward the later part, you get this law about what you do when you kill animals and sacrifice. And so you are allowed to eat meat. That's important to know because there are some traditions where you wouldn't be allowed to. But it says, be sure that you do not eat the blood, for the blood is the life, and you shall not eat the life with the meat. Now, this is kind of interesting because that term for life is nephesh. So, be sure you do not eat the blood, for the blood is the nephesh, and you shall not eat the nephesh with the meat, which I don't remember if is basar. So what do you think about this? What does this tell you about what the nephesh is? Got any reaction to this? A sense of, right? So why not drink the blood? Because the blood is the nephesh. Why not then? What's it telling you? It's not cannibalism. We're not eating. Yeah?
It seems to indicate almost like a soul or like a spiritual sort of existence within the animal that lives in the blood. And by eating it, I don't want to say it's like I guess it would be a sin. It says you shall not.
That tells you, yes. It's going to tell you not to do it.
Greater power within the blood that the meat does not.
Yeah, I mean, I like your line of thought, right? That somehow, right? I mean, for one, you're distinguishing between the blood and the meat, and somehow the meat's okay, and the blood carries something about the being of even an animal that you don't want to touch. But isn't that interesting, huh? You know, that you separate it that way? Yeah? Go ahead. Yes, you.
I think more for ethical reasons, because meat is something that you have to kill, and it's dead, and you're mixing something that is life and keeps it living with something that is dead, and so they shouldn't be put together, they should be separated.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of funny, though, to think, well, meat is separate from the blood that's the life, but of course at that point you're thinking after it's been dead and it's just sort of sitting around. But when you think that you're actually killing the animal, at that point it's all one living animal, and it's so interesting, right, that they take the blood and they say, no, it's just the blood. Yeah?
Show the text earlier where it's talking about how God's going to limit the life,
Yeah, how long you can live.
So maybe like since the life is in the blood, like those believe that if you eat the blood, then somehow that extends your life.
That is an interesting question. That's a nice idea. I hadn't thought of that. I don't know if everybody heard, right? I mean, what if it's kind of, I mean, what the analogy would be if it's kind of like an ongoing opportunity to be like the tree of life in the Garden of Eden or something like that, whereas if you ate blood, you could extend your life and in a way that was, dangerous, inappropriate, a kind of rebellion against God. I don't know. That's an interesting idea. So let me show you another passage. At least for now, right? Then the thing that's so important about the first one is that for an animal, the blood is the nephesh. And remember what I said about this term that's from another language that seems to be another version of the same word, where it's the throat, it's the neck, it's the throat. And this is where, I mean, if you get cut in the throat, right, that more blood runs through that than any other part of your body. You can see the connection. So this next passage is from the book of Genesis. I've plucked them out of their context. This is now just the story of Rachel. This is Jacob's wife, Rachel, his beloved wife, Rachel, who has two sons, if you remember. She had Joseph, and then at the end of that birth story, they go on, and you hear about Jacob returning to the land. But then later on in chapter 35, you're told that just as she's having Benjamin as the second child, that she dies in childbirth. And it says, as her soul was departing, for she died, she named him Ben-Oni, but his father called him Benjamin. And this time, they've translated nephesh as soul. So you could say if you go with the other translation, when her life was departing, she named her son as she died, one thing, and then after she's gone, and Ben-Oni means something like son of suffering, or my suffering. And so his dad thought that wouldn't be a nice name to carry around for his lifetime, and thought, no, let's change him to something else. So I suppose the interesting thing here is that in this case, this nephesh, when you die, is said to leave your body. Right? So it's different than from the flesh, which is just, the flesh is the thing that you have that lives or dies. But the nephesh seems to be something that you have that can actually leave. And this is not a death, like nobody stabbed her or something like that. It's not a death, if you go over to the blood thing, that the blood is the nephesh. In this case, I don't know what they're saying, that the blood is ceasing to flow, or blood is still in her. But at the same time, when you die, they understand that your nephesh leaves you. So in a way, it's something unlike the basar, which is only alive as long as you're alive, and it only really has any connection to you as long as you're alive. Or your remains could, I suppose, be connected to basar. But I think even then that basar would be more your body with its flesh, not just your bones, which would be another category. So in this case, we have the flesh, or rather the nephesh that leaves you. Then I have this psalm. Something didn't come out right in this. So I bet that it's an English Hebrew thing. So the thing about the Psalms is that the English translation usually counts the heading as a verse number. Yeah, it's going to be the next one, I think, right? Oh, is it going to be the other way around? Yeah, I suppose. Oh Lord, you're reading ahead of me. You brought up my soul, my nephesh, from Sheol. You restored me to life from among those gone down to the pit. So this is just to get a little bit more of a picture for what happens when you die. So, Sheol is the world it's the world under the ground where all dead beings end up. And of course, even that implies that even when you die, you have some kind of existence. And so that's identified especially with your nephesh that continues to hang around. It's got to go somewhere. And it turns out that what people don't want is nephesh-related beings bothering people later. Your nephesh is supposed to go down to the ground and stay there. But of course, you're in no hurry, which is why the psalm goes this way. One more, and this goes back. This is creation, Genesis 2:7. The Lord God formed man, human, but it's going to be the guy, from the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. And it's the last phrase, living being, that is the nephesh chaya, I think. And so being is the term for nephesh there. So the question again is, what does this represent? Now, at some point when I went through all of this, I just gathered references to this term. And these are the kinds of things that were associated with this. That the nephesh is the seat of the appetites. Hunger, thirst, desire, loathing, sorrow, joy, love, hate. That all of these things, not so much emotions as things that you want, things also that you feel, are tied to the nephesh. And that this is something that outlasts you when you die. So let me give you the next one. All right, so now we have this. So we have the flesh, which is basar. We have the throat, which is associated with the blood and with your life. And the next is your ruach. It would say R-U-A-H, though with a hard H. And this is most literally wind, if it's what you'd feel when you're outside. And it's usually translated spirit. It's a movement of air. So what do you think it is in a person? Yeah, I think so, right? Breath. So if you have blood that's associated with the nephesh, then your breath is what's associated with the Ruach. And all of this kind of inhabits, I guess, the basar. So these are the parts of a person. Genesis 6:17, for my part, I'm going to bring a flood of, this back to the flood, I'm going to bring a flood of waters on the earth to destroy from under heaven all flesh in which is the breath of life. Everything that is on the earth shall die. So this is, it combines both the sort of flesh part with this breath, the spirit that's in it. One of the things then that I wanted to try to figure out is, what's the difference between what a nephesh does and what a ruach does? So take a look. Couple of examples. Ahab went home resentful and sullen because of what Naboth the Jezreelite had said to him. For he had said, I will not give you my ancestral inheritance. He lay down in his bed, turned away his face, and would not eat. His wife Jezebel came to him and said, why are you so depressed that you will not eat? And what she literally says is, why has your spirit left? Why has your spirit left? And then this next one, when all the kings of the Amorites beyond the Jordan to the west and all the kings of the Canaanites by the sea heard that the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan for the Israelites until they crossed over, their hearts melted. There was no longer any spirit in them because of the Israelites. And so, in a way, this is now a whole army having the same problem that the king has in the other example. So, between these, it looks, the thing that I had noticed between this and the nephesh is that the ruach seems to be more active. It's not just how you feel, but it's what drives you to act. Like if you have no ruach, you have no ability to get yourself up and do something. And this is true for both an army in the second one and a king in the first one. Last one. So the fourth category is the lev. They'll say L-E-V, which is the heart or guts. It's not, for them, they didn't think, like, so you have to kind of break out of a modern way of thinking about people. Like, aside from this, what body part is missing so far from what we've talked about? I mean, this would be the heart, although the brain, yeah. Like all the stuff that we would, like when we talked about modern categories of the person, it all revolves around the brain, right? Because so much is our thinking, one way or another, whether it's personality or whether it's intelligence or whether it's even what you believe. They had no notion that what was in your head had any value at all, except for that somehow, you know, when you cut off the head, a lot of blood gushed out, and that was probably a bad thing. So they didn't think that what was up in your head had anything to do with what went on in your mind, and instead they associated that with your heart. And they knew what the heart was. I mean, they have enough experience with animal bodies and humans that have died and been killed in battle and whatnot. And of course, remember that the nephesh is associated with blood. So there's some kind of connection. Now, so what they do, they thought, so more or less when you read heart, like there's a line that literally translated in the, what's called the Shema in Deuteronomy chapter 6. In fact, there it is. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, which is nephesh, and with all your might, which is another category. But what's interesting is when they say love the Lord with all your heart, they mean with your mind, with all of your thought. because that was the primary function of the heart. But they used this term for your middle, not just for the organ that was your heart. And they had no place for the brain. So one other passage up there in the prophet, they do not know nor do they comprehend. This is talking about idols, or the objection that a biblical prophet has to worship with any human form that's rendered as a statue or a figurine or something like that. What's wrong with them? They do not know, nor do they comprehend, for their eyes are shut so they cannot see, and their minds as well, so they cannot understand. But I mean, that's their heart. But of course, this is now, I guess, the people who make them. No one considers, nor is there knowledge or discernment to say, half of it I burned in the fire, I also baked bread on its coals, I roasted meat and have eaten. Now shall I make the rest of it an abomination? Shall I fall down before a block of wood? So this is like a slam dunk argument from the point of view of the prophet, right? Like how on earth could you take half of this piece of wood and cook with it, and the other half and make a god with it, and think it's really a god? Though, of course, if you really were doing this, you'd say, no, like we understand it's wood, it has to be specially transformed, by the time you carve it and you perform rituals and everything that allow the god to enter it and identify with it. But the point at the beginning is this notion that what goes with idolatry for a biblical writer is the notion that the heart has been shut, so that their minds are shut, in a sense. So, what do we have? 4 dimensions for human life, for the human being. Flesh, sort of blood, soul, if you call it that. Breath, spirit, heart, mind. Right? So, how do you think that this would affect the way they approach life? Right? So this is it for them. Right? A little bit I've selected for you. It's not as if there aren't any other categories that relate. So think of this list, right? So again, it's flesh. So flesh, basar. This throat, blood, life, nephesh. Then the ruach, which is their breath or spirit, and their heart or mind. Yeah?
Seems like we were listing like personality and all these other more complicated categories, and this is like much more, not simplistic, but just basic. Like, there's not
Okay.
any.
What's the difference? Like when we say, what would be the effect of this if you say, well, we think personality or intelligence and instead they're thinking, what happens? I mean, you don't even have to answer the question directly, right? But what happens by using these categories instead? Yeah?
Was there an answer to your original
Yeah,
question?
go ahead.
So it seems like there's a divide between like external things of the body and internal things of the body, and I think that because they didn't have modern science like we have today, the inside of the body was much more of a mystery to them. So, or how it functions
Yeah.
at least. So perhaps that's why they attributed like internal things like blood and the heart to like more divine, like life or breath, like.
Yeah.
But like, for example, the part of Genesis where they become flesh, that's like, it's a kind of like a punishment. It's like, now you're just flesh. We all know what flesh is.
Right, that's interesting. I mean, in a way, so you're saying, think about what's internal versus not. In a way, the flesh category is the one that's kind of not internal. That's the package. And all the other 3 are internal. And you're right, that the external one, or at least the flesh, is this, that's the package that's either alive or dead, and it can die. and you're right, all the other three then are stuff that goes on inside. And it's funny though, in a way that the one of those that I think even they knew was a physical part that they could put their hands on if they had to, was the heart. And so for the others, they choose, blood, in a sense, although they had a separate word for blood. So it's not that they meant blood, there was something in the blood. And then breath, evidently. Any other reactions to this? Right? If you think about how this affected the way you approach the mind, I mean, one of the things that at least, if you go back to, go ahead.
Oh.
Yeah, go ahead. No, let you talk.
It seems that they placed a big importance on speaking because, like, to show that you're thinking, you express your heart with your wind and your breath through your nephesh.
Okay.
Whereas when you're like writing, you don't use any of those parts.
So that's interesting. Yeah, that even speech requires an expression of breath, right?
And I saw that in the Rachel part where she speaks
as her nephesh in this case is leaving. Yeah. Now I like the idea of speech because, I mean, for one, and when we were talking about intelligence or personality, and if you think about speech, that would be an expression of who you are. I mean, if you talked about personality, it'd be sort of what you say. But you also remind me of the thing about the spirit and this kind of ability to act as opposed to just what you say. It'd be interesting to try to work out how the spirit is related to speech, for instance, or as opposed to action. And then again, when I said that the nephesh is associated with desires and urges and feelings and things like that, but not with speech per se. So I have a feeling that speech is going to end up being tied up with all of these in different ways, and it'd be a really interesting thing to play out. But the thing I was going to say was that, at least in the world of sort of Roman, post-Roman times, with the birth of Christianity, there had developed out of a kind of a Greek background this notion of the person being divided up into three discrete parts, which were the soul, the body, and the spirit. And this followed certain Greek terms, and the notion was that each one of these had certain roles. But one of the things that people, especially who weren't sharing those texts and those traditions, pointed out was that this version of the person just doesn't divide up that way. That it's, you've got this package again, which is the flesh, and then you've got these dimensions of the life within it, these three different ways of thinking about it, but they're not, mutually discrete. In fact, again, to go back to your question about communication, that would be an interesting way of connecting them, because I think that you wouldn't find that each one was totally separate. Okay, with a few minutes left, let me take a little bit of a look at Saul. This should ring a bell a little bit from the first paper. Do you remember what Saul did that might lead one to think that he was a little bit unbalanced? And you were focusing on Jonathan maybe and David, but Saul does come into that story, right? He chases David around in the wilderness. Do you remember what he does? There's this scene where, go ahead. Yeah, remember that? So he throws a spear at him. But he also, I'm trying to remember. There's at least sort of an episode with David and an episode with Jonathan. But there's this sense that he just lets loose. Now, of course, then he'll argue that he's in the right, but he just really flies off the handle. And then, do you remember why David is said to have been brought to Saul in the beginning? If you remember that part at all. It said that actually, there's kind of two stories. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, he's supposed to play music. So on one hand, there is the thing about David coming to fight against Goliath and stuff. But before that, actually, David is introduced in a story about Saul being troubled. And it would say, I think in his spirit even. And it would that was the basis for needing to have somebody come and help calm him down. So let's look at this one story, which is 1 Samuel 16. Now the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him. So again, this is the Ruach category. But what's interesting now is that the Ruach that we're talking about is not Saul's own Ruach, or at least for the purposes of how it works on him. He had a spirit, a Ruach, from Yahweh, and this was actually tied with him going around with prophets, but it departs from him, which is part of God rejecting him as king. And instead he ends up with an evil Ruach, also from Yahweh, which is all interesting in terms of what you can expect from God. And Saul's servant said to him, "See now, an evil spirit from God, an evil Ruach from God is tormenting you. Let our Lord now command the servants who attend you to look for someone who is skillful in playing the lyre, and when the evil spirit from God is upon you, he will play it and you will feel better." So this is the story that I was just asking about. So Saul said to his servants, "Provide me someone who can play well and bring him to me." One of them said, "I have seen a son of Jesse, the Bethlehemite, who is skillful in playing, a man of valor, a warrior, prudent in speech." There's the speech thing. I don't know how that connects. "And a man of good presence, and the Lord is with him." So Saul sent messengers to Jesse, and they asked for him. So Jesse sends him along with a bunch of provisions. And David came to Saul and entered his service. Saul loved him greatly. Interesting use of that term from before. He became his armor bearer, and Saul sent to Jesse, saying, "Let David remain in my service, for he has found favor in my sight." And whenever the evil spirit from God came upon Saul, David took the lyre and played it with his hand, and Saul would be relieved and feel better, and the evil spirit would depart from him. So, a couple of things then to notice as you work your way through. So first of all, notice the kind of movement of the spirit, that it comes and goes, which was also true of the spirit when I talked about it before, that it could leave you, and if the spirit left, like the king Ahab, then he was depressed, the translation said. He couldn't act. This second one, when it says an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him, the word that's used there is a word that means something like to startle or terrify. There's a kind of suddenness about it, that it leaps upon him in a sense. Notice that evil is attributed to God in the midst of all this. God is not let off the hook. Notice that the effect is visible to everybody, that in this whole thing of a spirit from God that's upon him for good or for bad, that everybody can see it. And then notice also that the evil spirit leaves. And so again, this is what happens with spirits, whether it's they're human or divine. I'm almost out of time. And so I was going to ask, what would you see from this in terms of the psychology? I guess the thing that has got to be strange, like if you were an ancient Israelite therapist, then I guess what you should notice is that just from this passage, if you've got somebody who's troubled, there are 3 ruachs that are all possible, right? You've got to account for 3. There's the person's own ruach, and yet, based on Saul, there's the possibility of sort of external ruach invasion, right? And so you could either have a good invasion from, or at least a benign one. I mean, it might be a little strange, but that would be the spirit of Yahweh. Or you could have this bad one that also is said in these stories to come from Yahweh. And it's that bad one that is what really brings Saul down. And it's that bad spirit that's from outside him that makes him crazy, if you call it that, at least non-functional, right? So it's the one that destroys him. And so what's odd is to think that if somebody's really doing badly, this Hebrew psychology, at least, would blame God. But not in the sense that it's God's own spirit, but that God has the power to send you something that you can't deal with. And that's this evil spirit from Yahweh, which sort of terrifies him, startles him, overwhelms him. So, the main thing to get out of this, this is my goal in a way for the whole course when it comes to the text that we've read. And that is to realize that when you're looking at ancient Israel and the ancient Israelites, however familiar the Bible might be or not, but whatever you might expect of people from this ancient world, the starting point for getting into their world is to realize how different it is from ours. And with every thing that you do to try to investigate this world, to expect it to be different from our own. So when it comes to psychology, what you should see in this is that they did not think like us. They had different assumptions about how the mind worked. And in this case, whether it was a gift or a curse, that ultimately, when people behaved out of the ordinary, it was understood to come from outside themselves, like with Saul. So I guess that's it.